Okay, always the question, is this on? Okay. Thank you all very much. This is going to be informal this evening. I hope it's enjoyable. We're going to hear a little bit from all of the authors. And I'm glad you're here. I think most of you seem to have a book under your arm, or more than one, so that is good. As we've mentioned, the previous book the Historical Society put out was published in 1983, so it was 35 years ago. And we've learned a lot in between. I'm not going to say a lot has changed in between, because for some of the years, we just didn't know about all the things that had happened, but we have learned more. And so we decided it was time to put out a book, to update it, and to put in new material. You see the book here, and of course the authors up here who did all the work. But as members of the Historical Society, or people that are interested in the book, I want you to know that more went into it than just gathering the people and copy editing and copy editing and copy editing and on and on. We discussed it at length for a while, what type of book we wanted to do. Did we want to do it thematically? Did we want to do it chronologically like the previous book? We consulted with several of the entities in St. Augustine that are the people who sell most of our book, especially the bookstore at the Castillo de San Marcos. And they said, do it chronologically. That will work best. And so we took outside information and outside opinion on that. We also asked them about price point, because we didn't want to, sell ourselves out low, but we also didn't want to price ourselves out of the market. And so we got some input from the outside as to what the price should be as well. This book aims for a general audience that is interested in St. Augustine, but we have asked, stunning scholars to participate in it. And this book, unlike the previous book that came out 35 years ago, has endnotes. It has notes at the end of the book, which makes it more valuable for researchers. They can see where your material came from, and they are more likely to quote it or cite it in academic works. So those are there for those of you that aren't interested. You can just whoosh right back past those pages and go on to the next chapter. We have an index as well. And one of the things we really worked hard to do, and I think a number of you have mentioned it already, we really worked hard to get good images in the book, good, bright images, because people expect good, bright images in the books that they publish today, or the student books that they purchase today, and so we worked very hard at that. There's some of the old standard maps in here. We have to have some of the old standard pictures, and then there's some that maybe you haven't seen before, or maybe you haven't seen in a long time. And we had, while I'm talking about the pictures, I'd like to especially thank, we had a lot of help, certainly the library staff. The former executive editor of the St. Augustine Record, Craig Richardson, was very helpful in making record photos available. And Jim Cusick, who is one of the authors, but is also the curator at the University of Florida Florida History Library, was extremely helpful in providing us with images as well. Or if you can't provide an image, maybe you can provide a hint as to where you can find one. So I welcome you all, and the first thing I want to do tonight is a very important part of the book. Most of you have books, so if you look on page, it's not numbered, but just on the others to the right of the copyright page, you will see the dedication of the books to Dr. Michael Bennett. Gigi, could you come up, please? We were able to use this, what I think is a wonderful photo of Mike. He looks like he's ready to say something to you. And it is a photo by Jerry Yulesman, who is an internationally renowned photographer. Many of you probably know him from the University of Florida. Gigi was instrumental in us getting the release from him to use this, and he and Mike were very good friends. Is that not correct? Yeah. Yes. So we're very pleased that we could have that. And I want you to know also that we had decided to dedicate this book to Mike before he passed away. So this was an honor we thought he deserved while he was still alive. It's just unfortunately the book did not come out in time for him to see it. And I particularly like that we included, 4 of the main aspects, not all of the aspects of his character, but teacher, historian, humanist, and anyone that knew him, raconteur. And so, Gigi, we are delighted to give this to you and for sharing Mike with us. And I wish he were here for this, and I know he wishes he were too. And Dr. Gannon was in on the initial planning. When we first talked about doing this book, he gave us his opinions, and anyone that knows Mike knows he gave us his opinions. Well, and they were valuable, that's not the point. So he had his hand metaphorically in this book as well. And the epilogue at the very end of the book, you will enjoy, I think, reading. It is a reprint from the Florida Humanities Council magazine forum, and it's a reminiscence by Mike about being a child and riding around St. Augustine on his bicycle and enjoying it during his childhood.
Thank you, Susan, for this very valuable book for St. Augustine and for Floridians. I am very grateful to Susan for taking on the editorship of this book. Susan was a student of Michael, and he edited books, and now she is following his tradition. So many, many thanks, Susan, for all your work and effort and your thoughtfulness in remembering Mike. And I'd like to also thank all the authors who contributed to this book. What a profound impact you're making on St. Augustine and its history. Many, many thanks to all of you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we're going to have in just a minute about 5 minutes. I told them 5 minutes max. Presentations by the authors. I asked them to perhaps talk about something they did not include in their chapter that they thought might be interesting, or some other thoughts that they have, because as we know, and I'm sure someone will tell me, you cannot include everything in a book, and I'm sure someone's going to tell me what I did not include. You know, you could write volumes about St. Augustine, but that was not our intention. It was to provide you, although a lot of you know the story, but other people, with the framework for perhaps understanding some of the other stories that you hear. I do have one thing to say before we go any further, and that is, I get a 24-hour free zone from any complaints about the book. You cannot contact me about any complaints until 7:16 p.m. tomorrow night. And we know that there's errors in it, because I said it's a book that was written by humans and produced by humans, and so somewhere in there's bound to be an error. I would like to, before I start, I would like to use the first sentence from the book in the first chapter, which I think really represents what I wanted the book to do, and that is to represent some of the turning points in St. Augustine's history. And sometimes a turning point is an event that something didn't happen just as well. You know, sometimes when something doesn't happen, it becomes a turning point. But I think the first sentence in the first chapter, which was written by Kathleen Deegan and Carl Halbert, I just love, because it starts us with a turning point. One can only imagine what the native Timucuan people of today's St. Augustine felt in September of 1565, when they saw the sails of Admiral Pedro Menendez de Avilés, 5 ships off their shores. What a turning point that is. And so we start the book with a turning point. As I said, this is going to be kind of an entertaining event. This is a historical book, and so as I introduce each of the authors, and I don't quite have it for everybody because there's a little uncertainty as to who might be here. I have turned this into an historical event myself because I have a historic photo of some of the authors. Not just a single photo, and not all of them, you know, some of them are rather blurry because that was what I had access to. So since Kathleen Deegan and Carl Halbert share the first book, you get a photo of Kathy, but Carl's presentation. Kathy running the field school in St. Augustine.
Thank you, Susan.
You don't know which ones I called. Carl, would you like to make your comments about the chapter.
Yes, thank you very much, Susan. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right, fine. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Susan Parker for being the vanguard, bringing this second edition of The Oldest City to light. The phrase, a labor of love, truly reflects her dedication to showcasing St. Augustine's multifaceted history in a single book. And then second of all, I would just like to acknowledge the St. Augustine Historical Society, for without them, the public would not have access to this valuable set of information. I think this reflects their continuous leadership in protecting and promoting the city's story. And if you please indulge me, I'm not really good at public speaking, so I just kind of wrote something out here. But when I came to St. Augustine 30 years ago, one of the first books I acquired was the first edition of The Oldest House. That book was my tutorial. Every chapter, from the prehistoric to the 20th century, had equal weight in bringing to life the city's unique heritage. My first copy was so thoroughly covered with questions and comments that within a decade, I needed to acquire a second copy, which illustrates the influence that book had on my thinking. 35 years is a long time between when the first edition was printed in 1983 and the debut of this second edition. Consequently, a lot of new information has been extracted from dusty documents and unearthed from the ground. Nowhere is this more evident than in the prehistoric archaeological record. When Dr. John Griffin wrote his article on the Timucua in the original edition, very little actual digging of sites had occurred in St. Augustine that date to the prehistoric period. John actually had to rely on available historical narratives and excavations conducted elsewhere in Northeast Florida to come up with his story. Since then, Dr. Kathleen Deegan and her students have conducted over 40 years of intermittent excavations at the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park, dealing with both prehistoric and historic Native American sites, Native American occupations. This effort has been augmented by excavations conducted by the city within and around the Fountain of Youth, at prehistoric sites on Anastasia Island, and historic 18th century refugee mission sites on the outskirts of the colonial walled city. And this is due to the city's adoption of an archaeological preservation ordinance in 1986 and the ensuing 800 plus excavations that have occurred since then. The data unearthed not only enable us to extend Native American presence in the region dating back to a late Paleo-Indian period, that is roughly 10,000 years ago, but provide a broader perspective of change and continuity of past lifeways within St. Augustine during prehistory. It showed that for all intents and purposes, St. Augustine was a year-round home to a vibrant population for over 1,000 years by the time Pedro Menendez arrived here in 1562. Now, what were some of those excavations that have occurred? Well, we found communal houses dating back roughly 1,500 years ago. We've also found a communal house dating back roughly 700 years ago. We have found just a slew of information related to diet, related to ceremonial activities, related to life as it was here in St. Augustine before the Europeans arrived. A lot of that still remains to be written, but we will eventually get there one of these days. Like John's chapter in 1993, the intent of this chapter is to provide the reader with a foundation for understanding a dynamic and vital demographic component to St. Augustine's history. The city recently celebrated its 450th anniversary. Not to be forgotten in that saga was the contributions and sacrifices made by indigenous peoples. And we always have to remember that. St. Augustine was home to Native Americans for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived here. And just finally, I would just like to thank Kathy, who asked me to be a co-author on this paper. It's been a pleasure and an honor working with her these past 30 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I'm going to take care of an oversight. There were 2 or 3 people who I missed when I was thanking before we go on further. Certainly one of them is Dr. Kathleen Deegan. She started out to be co-editor with me and then had other responsibilities, and went on to her work, and I went on with this. But she was there when we were first organizing it, and she was invaluable. The other people who helped make this book happen was Greg Smith, who is not here. He has family visiting. He copy edited the book, and Robert Parker, who's standing over there, who was the cover designer and laid the book out. So we have all those other people as well. But because I want you to know, this book, we didn't hand it over to a publishing house to put together. We handed it to a printer all ready to print. So we had to have everything set out exactly as it should be. And so layout at that point is a very big job. Let's move on though. Dr. Amy Bushnell. This is a portion of a photo that was taken at the release of this book, The Previous Oldest City, of which Amy Turner Bushnell was an author, and the authors dressed in period clothing appropriate to their chapter. And so, as you may or may not be able to tell, since it's just part of the photograph, she is dressed in the habit of a friar, because she dealt with the and I said I was going to have historic photos. But Amy, tell us what you'd like to say.
Yes, before I start all this, Jean Waterbury is responsible for my being in this getup. She told me that I was supposed to dress. Is this on?
No.
No, it's not. Is this on?
Yeah.
She gave me my assignment, which was to find the habit of a friar and come dressed as a Franciscan. And I didn't know how I was going to do this, so I went to the source. I called the Franciscans in town. And I said, this is what I've been asked to do. Will it offend you? Oh, they laughed. It was Father Doug that I was talking to. And he just laughed and he said, of course not. And I said, well, where would I find a costume and what should it be? And he said, triple knotted cord. Be sure you can have that. And he told me that I should go over to the what is the name of the theater, the production that we had for so long. That's it. And so they lent me a costume. And but Father Doug, when I first talked to him, I thought he called himself Father Duck. And I thought, Mother Goose and Father Duck. This is really good. But to be more serious, I thought the thing that has been left out of my chapter and out of my work in general is really an appreciation for the ordinary soldier. And I tried to correct for that back in 2006 when I wrote a piece called A Requiem for Lesser Conquerors. And it was because of something that really touched my heart that Jaime Martinez wrote when he had been asked by his Jesuit confessor to write the story of the Jesuits in Ajacan, Virginia. And so he said, yes, he would do that. But he wanted the Jesuits in return to say some masses for the 150 soldiers who had set sail with him for Florida. When he went to Florida, he says they were cruelly slain by Indians, and they've been forgotten as though they'd never been. He thought that in addition to the martyrs the Franciscan martyrs that had been so much appreciated and whose histories had been written. What about the soldiers, the ordinary soldiers who were being forgotten as though they had never been? And I thought, especially in the 17th century, for the 17th century, I had been gathering historical information out of the very, very scarce information that we had, scarce documents for the early 17th century. It seemed like every word that we could glean out of so few documents had so much meaning that we maybe only in one document could we find a reference to a battle or even a war, and we had to make so much out of them. And we were forgetting the people whose lives were being lost. And I have written much more about Indians in my last 20 years than I ever have about Spaniards. But I don't want to forget these other people as well, and I don't want you to forget them. And so I'm going to say a few things in their words because I know I don't have much time, so this is going to have to be very, very quick. One soldier who was with Captain Gutierrez de Miranda at the conquest of Potano, he said that if it hadn't been that he had his musket balls in his mouth, that those Indians would have knocked his teeth out. But he had a habit of carrying his musket balls in his mouth, and they protected his teeth. And there, another one, who said that he had traveled and been lost for 3 months, and he was on this expedition up into the interior. They were lost for 3 months and they were starving, and so they decided that they would have to cast lots and eat one of themselves. And so he said the lot fell on him, and his name I happen to know, Juan Bautista Terrazas. The lot fell on me, he said. He was writing about his merits and services. He was ready to sacrifice his life for his fellows. And he said, but fortunately, some people showed up, and then they showed us where we could go, and we got food. Other food. And then there were the soldiers who were with Juan Pardo, and one of them is who put all of those forts, in the interior in what is now Georgia and South Carolina, and they had to abandon their forts, and it's because an Indian chief sent word to them that he was going to kill them and eat them, and not sparing their dog. And I guess that this was just a little too much. You can threaten us, but not our dog. But I think that the merits and services accounts, that they are really touching, because we see in those the women too, the ones all of whose relatives have died in the wars, the Indian wars. And they say, well, my father died cut to pieces by Indians, and my grandfather was drowned, and and the whole families of men just seem to disappear in these wars. And so the women are left to grieve, and they are part of the story too. But that's enough about it.
Thank you. You'll notice that I've not introduced everyone individually, but if you have a book and you go to the back, you will see that the contributors are listed there with short bios. So if you want information about who the person speaking is, I don't have the page, right? I don't have a book up here with me. I don't have a book. But the contributors are back there, and all of their short bios are listed for that. And as you can see, if you've looked at the table of contents, we're going chronologically through the table of contents, although not everyone is here. which means I'm the next one up. You've heard enough from me already. I will not be talking about my chapter, which covers the time from the beginning of planning the Castillo until the Spanish left in 1763. My only comment would be that I've always had problems with the people that say, as the first Spanish period loomed to a close, well, the people here didn't know it was coming to a close. It was suddenly sprung upon them. And so that's, as we often do, reading back our own impressions into the past. But even though I was not planning on giving a presentation, I didn't think I should get out of not having a historic photo. That's why you thought I wasn't going to give a presentation. So I found one from several years ago, too. The next chapter following me is, of course, the British period with Dr. Dan Schaefer. Dan is out of the area for the summer and could not join us. So we will move on to Dr. Jim Cusick. As you can tell from if you've looked at the table of contents, Jim Cusick is a joint author with Dr. Pat Griffin, who was with us when we started the book, but Pat passed away while it was being written, and Jim finished it up. But there's a great deal of her in this book. And Jim, you don't have to cringe, because I couldn't find a very old picture.
I try very hard not
And the
to.
one I have is so low res that when you make it bigger than a postage stamp, you're very blurry. But please tell us about the second Spanish period.
Is this on? Does it sound like it's on? All right, well, as you can tell from my recent purchases, I'm thrilled that this book came out, and I want to thank Susan, and I want to thank everybody that contributed to it. One of the reasons I'm thrilled is because when I started graduate school, one of my first experiences in 1985 was coming here to St. Augustine to work in field school with Dr. Deacon. And the original copy of The Oldest City was one of our textbooks. And I loved that book. I read it, I still have my copy from those days, and I read it many times, and I referred to it many times. As Susan said, I was lucky enough to be co-author with Pat Griffin on the chapter on Second Spanish Period. And I hope that you enjoy reading that chapter, because I have to tell you that Pat and I just had a hoot writing it. We wrote it at the kitchen table at her house. And if you've read the original, you know that Pat is an extremely good writer, which posed some problems for us, because we wanted very much to preserve a lot of what was in her original chapter, but we also had to update it, and we had to keep it the same length. So parts of our discussion were what we were willing to sacrifice and what we could add in. It was a lot of fun because we thought, well, here we are, two anthropologists writing history. But I won't go into what we left out of the chapter, really. What we tried to add in, like I said, Pat's chapter, which is still one of the ones that I remember the most from the original book. Pat was very good at putting people in a place. Like when you go to the market in 1790, or actually 1817 with Pat in that book, you're at the market. You sense the market, you hear the market, you feel what was going on. And she was really, really good at that. The biggest problem that we both agreed that the original chapter had was that it kind of focused on the 1780s and 1790s, and then when you got to 1800 and beyond, there wasn't so much. And it was a really good chapter. He used to call that period the people mix chapter, or the people mix period, because there were so many different types of people, different ethnic groups living in St. Augustine at the time. And she did a wonderful job of including things on the Menorcans and on the Spanish and Cuban families. But a lot of the contributions of the black community were sort of left out, because a lot of their influence and a lot of what they were important with came in 1810, 1812, particularly in their military contributions in defending the colony at that period. So we wanted to make sure that got in. I had written about that period. In the meantime, Pat had written her book about Satiki, the slave of Buckingham Smith. She had brought out his memoir. We wanted to make sure he was well represented. So a lot of what we did basically was try to broaden out the chapter and also make sure that the post-1800 part of that period was as well represented as the pre-1800. And so it was really a chapter about the whole period from 1780 up until about 1820. And like I said, it was a wonderful experience. I came out of it a better writer because Pat was not about to let me muck up her chapter I'm writing. And so, like I said, I enjoyed the experience. I hope you enjoyed reading it.
Thank you, Jim. Going down the line, Tracy Upchurch is our next speaker. If you've looked at the table of contents, you know he presents us with a quote and something to ponder, said by one of the people that was stationed in St. Augustine. What is it, dull old place or Garden of Eden? The person was trying to decide which it was. So, Tracy, which do you think it was?
Well, let me say two things. One is this young man who is a federal soldier in 1862 stationed in St. Augustine writes home and talks about what an incredibly dull place St. Augustine is, but at the same time has this vision, particularly for Northerners, of what St. Augustine could become. And clearly that time, if we think about it, it's really just 20 years before the arrival of Flagler. But I also think that it's not dissimilar to how St. Augustine was probably in the 1960s. It was a quiet southern place, but with the 400th anniversary and really the embracing of our history, the promotion of our history, changes radically. I remember as a small boy how excited my family was that there was an article in National Geographic about St. Augustine. But now, if we are not on Forbes's list or Travel and Leisure's list or somebody's list every week, we think, what the hell? The second thing I just want to touch upon, on page 181 of the book is a wonderful reproduction of the flag of the St. Augustine Blues, the local company that marches away in 1861, 1862 to fight for the Confederacy. My wife and I had the opportunity to see the original flag in the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, and it is one of their poster children. It is beautifully preserved. They have reproduced it on postcards, and it was an exciting thing to see this restored, preserved in that museum. But what I love about these regimental flags, there's so many things I love about these regimental flags. One is that as an example of artwork, and I'm not just talking about the one that left St. Augustine, but the ones that left countless cities across the country as their young men marched away to war. They are beautiful works of art, and we are so fortunate as a community that ours is so beautifully preserved. They have an incredibly important military purpose. These are used to identify military units, and so they have a very practical use. They have a moral, not a moral, but a morale purpose in identifying and bonding for a unit. But what's also particularly wonderful is that these flags are created by the women of the community. So this is an example of political advocacy by the women of the community. We understand this is a period of time when in many ways women are shunted out of the political discourse. But these things are conceived and executed, so the mottos that they represent, the images that they represent, are women's voices. And I think one of the other wonderful things about them is they are presented in public ceremonies where women are in the forefront. They are presented typically by young women. The matrons of the community are involved, the units are there. And so there's so much that go into these flags. I find it really, really exciting. Minnesota and Virginia are still fighting over these things. The Minnesotans took some from Gettysburg and they won't give them back. And so even today they carry this powerful symbolism that we still find ourselves engaged in it. So think about the flag. I encourage you to spend a little bit of time on the internet and seeing some of these other beautiful representations from communities across the country. Thank you.
Oh, I forgot to show you Tracy.
It's a long damn time ago.
Not as long as some of the other folks. Tom Graham is our next speaker, and this is Tom. Actually, this is out of the same photograph that Amy in the hat. Since he was one of the authors of the previous book, he too was dressed to represent the time period of his chapter of the oldest city. And so I left Tom here, cropped the others out. Amy's on the other side over here in the white space. And so there's Tom in 1983 when the book came out. And Tom, can you tell us about what you'd like to add about your chapter?
Good. Now, am I on?
Yep.
Okay. Now, I showed my granddaughter this picture, and she did not recognize me. Oh, boy. But I certainly felt like a young whippersnapper at that time. I mean, there were giants in the earth in those days. Mike Gannon, Gene Waterbury, John and Pat Griffin, and I just felt really honored to be included in that group. And now, I'm glad I'm still alive.
Deep breathing, Tom.
Well, what I left out, I've got 1877 end of Reconstruction to 1941. So, boy, a lot of changes in St. Augustine in that time period. One thing I skipped over was World War I. I was reading the chapter recently, and I said, well, I have one short paragraph. It said, not much happened in town. The war was too short. But a few things did happen in World War I. One thing I'll kind of give you the ending at the beginning is every time there is a war that brings soldiers from the outside to St. Augustine, like the Civil War, like the Spanish-American War, like World War I and World War II, the soldiers come to St. Augustine, they like the place, and they all say it's strange, weird, like nothing else in America. But then a lot of them come back after the war's over. So World War I is kind of a prelude to the boom of the 1920s because we had a big army base in Jacksonville and had a lot of army soldiers that came to St. Augustine as tourists. Well, let's see. People had an idea that war was coming in 1913, 1914, although the number one candidate to go to war with was Mexico at that time. And in an old St. Augustine tradition, we organized a couple of militia units of civilian soldiers. But then in 1917, the United States entered the war. Very quickly, there was a draft. Men signed up for the Army voluntarily. There was a big rally on the plaza, patriotic. The French stage actress Sarah Bernhardt appeared at the Jefferson Theater to rally American support for France. In those days, we had a big water tower on Hippolyta Street. So anybody old enough? No, I'm not going to ask. But it was a huge thing right there in the middle of town. And they hung a huge American flag from the top of the water tower on Hippolyta Street to rally American patriotism. And as we usually do, we started, I don't know that they were called victory gardens, but people were encouraged to grow backyard gardens. The potato farmers in Hastings gathered up carloads of potatoes to send them north and then to put them on ships to send them over to the starving children in Belgium. So we were contributing that way. Interesting, in World War I, there was a lot of national concern about spies and saboteurs. And you may remember stories that German saboteurs were putting ground glass in food. How absurd, and yet people worried about that. Well, we had a Navy wireless station just east of the White House, and they put up a barbed wire barricade around the wireless station in case German saboteurs wanted to attack that. The Navy used it to communicate with ships at sea. We had Luella Day, the owner of the Fountain of Youth. She was arrested because she was caught with a radio in her possession. And it was like, which is an ordinary crystal set. But she was a strange woman. She was a woman, and who knew but the Germans were communicating with her. So they took her into custody for a while. Interesting thing here, the first draft call was for white men only. But as happened in the Civil War, by 1918, the draft was extended to black men. So the first wave of men leaving St. Augustine for the Army were white. Second wave were black men. We had some Navy submarine chasers that spent some time in our bay here. Civilians were impacted in the winter of 1918 when the government started rationing coal. And the government declared Mondays as days when businesses could not turn on their heaters and could not turn on their electric lights in order to save coal. And the city fathers in St. Augustine, city fathers are always willing to help us out. They got the woodcutters in the neighborhood to bring in firewood. And they created a big woodlot in town so that people who were burning coal in their kitchen ovens could burn wood instead. This didn't last too long. It was just a couple of months, and then the government says, oh, that's too big a hassle. To ask businesses to shut down one day a week and not burn any coal or electricity. Well, let's see. Towards the end of the war, there was a possibility that we might get an air station here in town. And they looked around for an airfield. One idea was a place way out on what is today State Road 16. But closer in town, we had the Little Links golf course at the south end of town, what is today Gallimore Center and that area. And so we had a couple of planes land on what had been Henry Flagler's golf course down there. But then the war ended, and the idea of an air base here in town went by the way. Well, after the war, we had some celebrations. In 1920, a local sculptor, C. Adrian Pillars, sculpted a plaque, a bronze plaque, that was put in the post office with the names of the dead from World War I. This plaque has moved a little bit. For a while it was at the VFW building, the Hamblin building. And now, just recently, it's back in the east wing of the governor's house, where it was originally. And I guess that's appropriate. And then for the first celebration of Armistice Day, November 11th, 1941, that's the first time we had a national declaration of Armistice Day, there was the unveiling of the memorial pedestal in Anderson Circle, right in front of the Hamblin House, with the flagstaff that was on it. Pillars also sculpted the bronze base for that memorial pedestal. And so we had a commemoration in 1921 for Armistice Day to mark the end of the war. And then we were off into the roaring 20s, D.P. Davis and all that. And then the not so roaring 1930s, which I say ironically was maybe good for the preservation movement, which got cranked up in the 30s with the Carnegie Foundation putting some money into the early preservation movement in town. But the best part of preservation in the 30s was nothing new was being built. So a lot of the old Spanish buildings stayed up because nobody had a motive to knock them down. But then comes the last chapters of the book.
Thank you, Tom. Well, Tom nicely segued into the last chapter of the book, which was written by Paul Weaver. To me, maybe not to other people, but for me, I think this is one of the more challenging chapters to do of the book. It's sometimes when you have lived part of it, or you're very close to it, or you've heard your parents or grandparents talk about a time, sometimes it's harder to be as analytical as it is from 200 or 300 years ago. It's been too much of your life. But Paul did a great job with it, and he has a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to show you a historic photo of Paul because he has his own historic photo that he will be presenting as part of his PowerPoint.
I think all I can do now is just. There we go.
We don't want that on the side.
So we've heard some common themes tonight, and I think one of them is the thanks we give, because all of us up here, I think, stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us that mentored us in this endeavor. And I wanted to start by thanking Dr. Susan Parker. It's not the first time I've worked with Susan, but I think Amy Bushnell, I remember talking with her, every writer needs a good editor. And Susan and I have developed a great relationship over the years. Susan is very direct. I did an article for Ellis Cubano some years ago. And unlike a lot of the people here, I do more administrative history and manuscript. And she goes, Paul, this is great, but it sounds like a National Register nomination. But point well taken. So thank you, Susan.
I didn't remember that.
Well, but I appreciate it. It was a very constructive comment. But yes, thank you. Some of the people I remember, Dr. Margaret Corrigan, who was my first instructor in expository writing, and it was one of those classes that you hated She was very demanding. I was humiliated sometimes, but I really liked it after the fact because I learned an awful lot. And I want to thank Dr. Samuel Proctor, University of Florida, Dr. David Colbert, and also Dr. Michael Ganna. I had the opportunity to work for Dr. Ganna 2 years on the Spanish calendar project that James Cusick later administered. And those people inspired me. They taught me scholarship and historical writing. And I want to thank Dr. Bill Adams and Dr. Michael Scarville here in St. Augustine, who gave me my first real opportunity to work in the professional history field and work on one of the classic things, I think, in St. Augustine history in recent years, the 1980 survey of historic buildings. And finally, I want to thank my mom. She was my first editor, very giving. Typed all back in the days when we used typewriters, she typed all my papers and my manuscripts and was a great editor. And you can ask my wife, we would debate at times about word usage and punctuation and things like that. I want to thank her for all the help that she gave me over the years. So, did you ever wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat? Well, I did a couple of times when I was writing my chapter. About things we're always worried about leaving things out. And I went to Susan, I said, oh my God, I forgot to write this about this particular event or about this particular institution. I think there was at least 2 occasions. She goes, Paul, I agree, that's important, we should include that. I won't say who those events and people were. You'll have to read that in my tell-all book, which will be the next thing that I write. But one thing that I did leave out, and I want to talk a little bit about this, and I think it's a little exciting project that society is doing. And one of the things, I'm on the board of directors. I think we're concerned about the sustainability of society, broadening its base, bringing in new people, and bringing in young people. I'm really excited about where we are as a society these days because we've got Megan Wilson, Claire Barnabelle was involved in this project. And it's a project about documenting the history of the surf culture here in St. Augustine. And this is one thing I left out of the book. And so it's part of, I guess, maybe a revisionist history. The next chapter we will probably include this. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about it. And very interesting, matter of fact, 2015 we celebrated the centennial of the history of surfing here in St. Augustine and St. Johns County. Megan was able to develop, find this document going back to 1915 that talked about the first, surfing experiences here in St. Augustine. And I think this is one of the first, probably anywhere in the United States outside of Hawaii. So a very, very interesting thing. And one of the things that they're doing is oral history. And I think it's very entertaining because they're doing interviews with people named Booger and Bubba. And I'm trying to think what the other names, Scambo and Smiley. And interestingly enough, one of those actually grew up to be a Presbyterian minister here in St. Augustine. So there is a life after. But in the period that I covered, which was a post-World War II period, surfing came into its own and became a very important leisure activity here in St. Augustine, particularly in the 1960s. St. Augustine Beach, and there was a place called Blowhole that attracted people from all over the country, all over the eastern United States in particular. And that's part of the things that the society is documenting. So, is there life after surfing? Well, you might grow up to be the mayor of St. Augustine. So yes, this is our mayor, Joe Bowles. And I met Joe Bowles at a Young Life camp back in, I think, 1971, along with Smiley Sturgis. And I will say no more because I do not want to jeopardize any future political aspirations that you might have. So, you can be a surfer and you might grow up to be the president of St. Augustine. So with that, I want to raise my glass and toast Susan, Megan, and the St. Augustine Historical Society and all the people that participated in that. Thank you very much.
I want to make sure you got the connection that the person in the surfing shorts was Paul. It wasn't just a random surfer.
Believe it or not.
No, that's not what I said. I just want to make sure that you realize that was his historic photo that he actually brought to the table. Thank you very much. I think you're going to say. We will move towards, if you would like to have your book signed, we have the authors up here ready to sign. I think we can just kind of open the books and push them on, move them right on down the table. Well, I would request though that if you want to talk to the authors, have questions for them, please be respectful of the people behind you that are trying to have their books signed rather than monopolizing their time for 5 or 10 minutes while people behind you wait. I'm sure they'll be around for questions and answers later. So I think we can start the book signing. As soon as we have minutes.
No, I'll wait.
Thank you all very much for coming. I think it's been kind of